Hello everyone, me again, and today we're going to be looking at the third aspect of the Alexander II depth study, where we will focus in on whether Alexander II was successful in his dealings with the minorities of the Russian Empire, or whether he can be considered neglectful of them. This video, and the one that I'm going to do for afterwards, will likely be a little bit shorter than the previous two, as both of these themes are relatively straightforward and will be covered again in the studies that we do next year. Firstly, it is easy to forget that the Russian Empire was, and continues to be in many ways, a vast sprawling empire containing a patchwork of many different nationalities. Only around 45% of the population in 1860 was made up of people who would consider themselves as Russian. The empire consisted of Russia, or the Great Rus as they might call it, but also contained lots and lots of national minority groups. This is a very brief list, but it includes people like Poles, Finns, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, you've got Sibirs, you can go on forever, Yakuts. There are hundreds, literally hundreds. Therefore, around 55% of the population of the Russian Empire was drawn up by what we are going to consider for this video's sake minority groups. Admittedly, in their own separate areas they were majorities, but as an empire as a whole we are talking about minorities. The only one that differs in terms of their own area is Russian Jews, which, for complicated reasons which I'll explain in a minute, live in an artificially created geographical location called the Pale of Settlement. It is a fixed place that was decided by Tsars, and we'll talk about it in a bit. Now, luckily for us, in 1877, Alexander, being an excellent young man, decided to do a census for the Russian population, and this is publicly available as I'm showing you on screen now. It shows the multicultural nature of the Russian population here. Now, traditional historians tend to treat Russia as one homogeneous group of people, and they still do, which is silly. But more recent historians have attempted to delve more closely into the treatment of minorities in Russia. There's a really good quote by Werner Moss, which says that Alexander was a great Tsar and deserved a kind of fate. His was not a great intellect, but he had a generous soul, very upright and very lofty. He loved his people, and his attentiveness for the humble and their suffering was limitless. I'll be interested to see if that is correct, and whether Alexander II can be considered someone who loved his people, and whether he was concerned about their suffering or not. Interestingly, I note the religious group here has old believers in it, 1.75%. Do you know there's only one single old believer in the UK, according to the last census we did? One. Anyway, I'm distracting. For our depth study, it is important that we have a strong understanding of how some of the minority groups experienced Alexander II's reign. And we will be encountering these minority groups in depth again next year when we look at nationalities and satellite states. For now, however, I'm going to zoom in on 4 key groups that are both useful and quite easily memorable. These 4 groups are Poles, or Polish people, Finns from Finland, Jews, and finally Ukrainians, who shockingly come from Ukraine. Now, we are going to start off by looking at Poland, which is arguably the most important of the minority groups that Alexander had to deal with. Now, Alexander II is assassinated in 1881 by Narodnaya Volya, and it's easy to presume that Alexander II was, well, the biggest threat he faced was indeed terrorism in the form of socialists and revolutionaries. But in reality, probably the biggest threat he faced was in January 1863, an event the Poles affectionately remember as the January Uprising. Now, in Russian Poland, there was a lot of unrest. Poland had never traditionally been a part of Russia, and it had been on and off controlled by other countries. In the time of Alexander, it was divided, or the Polish people were divided into 3 different areas. That under the control of Austro-Hungary, that under the control of Prussia, and then finally, most of it, which was under control of the Russian Empire. The parts of Poland that were under control of the Russian Empire were held by a man called Grand Duke Constantine, who was actually the Tsar's brother. But on the second day of office of being in charge of the Polish area, he was actually wounded, supposedly by terrorist attack, although it's never actually been explained in detail. Alexander tried to appease the Poles as he reckoned that there was a likelihood that they would revolt, but this was unsuccessful. Polish students and landowners alike, desiring a national unity and a separate state from Russia, developed further opposition to the Tsar. These landowners organised themselves into what they called an agricultural society, which was essentially a revolutionary group. The Russians, in an attempt to try and appease this group, tried to set up a semi-autonomous regime under a man called Alexander Wielopolski, who was a Pole himself. But when the agricultural society was forcibly closed by Russian troops in 1863, there was further violence in response. In January 1863, the trigger, a forced enlistment to the army, was introduced to try and break up revolutionary groups and deprive Poland of fighting-age men. In response to the thought of being forced into the Russian army for 20 years, many nationalists went into hiding in the woods and started a guerrilla war with the Russians. This rebellion soon spread to Lithuania and Belarus. In the same month, Polish nationalists killed hundreds of Russian soldiers while sleeping in their barracks in Warsaw, and all 9 Polish provinces erupted into violence as all sections of the Polish community joined together to throw off the Russian control of Poland. The Russians, facing severe rebellion unlike they'd seen before, decided that they would respond with severe retaliation, and there were atrocities committed by both sides, including on the Russian side killing of thousands of civilians. In the end, the Russians were successful, unsurprisingly, and hundreds of Polish nobility were exiled and their estates deliberately transferred to Russian officials. Polish serfs received even greater terms than the Russians, such as land at cost paid for through taxes. They didn't have to pay any redemption payments, and the reason why Alexander II basically said they didn't have to pay redemption payments is so that he could get the Polish serfs on his side. The Zemstva was also instituted in Poland, and it included members of all parts of the Polish society, so there were lenient things given to Poland in response. However, on the opposite side, Russian became the official language of Poland. Polish was banned to a certain degree, and the Catholic Church was also banned from communicating with the Vatican. This basically is the beginning of Russification, a process that Alexander III would take up later after his father died and would champion during his reign. As for our second minority group, Finland, in 1863, Alexander II, impressed by Finland's, shall we say, positive attitude towards the Crimean War, he reconvened what he called the Diet or the Parliament of Finland and initiated several reforms that increased Finland's autonomy within the Russian Empire, even allowing establishment of its own currency, which was the marker. The liberation of business and the allowing of the Finns to have their own currency led to increased foreign investment and industrial development, which eventually allowed the average Pole to actually earn a lot more than the average person in the Russian Empire. Finland also got its own railways, separately established under Finnish administration. And finally, the elevation of Finnish from a language of the common people to a national language opened opportunities for a larger proportion of society. Alexander II is still today regarded as the good Tsar in Finland, and there are still statues of him to be found, such as this one in Helsinki. These reforms could be seen as results of a genuine belief that reforms were easier to test in an underpopulated, single ethnic group country than in the whole of Russia. Some people think that Finland was essentially a testbed for Alexander II's liberal policies. It could also be seen as a reward for the loyalty during the Crimean War and during the Polish uprising. The Finns were notoriously compliant with the Russian Empire, and they barely ever caused any problems when it came to rebellion. It's hard to say, but encouraging Finnish nationalism and language could also be seen as a carrot, sort of a way of showing other nationalist groups in Russia what they could have if they sort of almost behaved themselves. Finland was treated quite well by the Tsar. I think that much is very clear. Finland obviously got a good end of the deal, but the next one we're going to look at is not necessarily one that is just geographically specific. It is one that is varied and spread out across Russia. Judaism is not a nationalist group, but it is an ethnic group that is worth looking at. And the map you can see on screen is something called the Pale of Settlement. This is a western region of Russia, and essentially this was the only area in which Jews were allowed to live in. From 1791 onwards, if you were a Jew outside of this area, you could be liable for arrest and imprisonment for, I believe, up to 14 years. The Jewish population of Russia, which had been there since the early 1300s, underwent a degree of what we call secular enlightenment. They were very much interested in development, they were very much interested in business, and they were very much interested in education as well. Because of this, and because of their similar mindset, Alexander II relaxed discrimination against Jews in the Pale of Settlement, and allowed Jews with academic degrees only to live outside the Pale in cities such as Moscow and cities such as St. Petersburg. Jewish parents were allowed to send their children to Russian schools, and these students became attracted to new ideas. So the Jews received a fairly good end of the deal, and actually benefited considerably under Alexander II's reign. Finally, our last group, which I'll keep very brief, is Ukrainians. After the 1861 emancipation of the serfs in the Russian Empire, many Ukrainian landowners were unhappy with the loss of their serfs, and as you've already seen in your previous videos, peasants in Ukraine were generally very displeased with the terms of the emancipation as well. In this atmosphere of discontent and unhappiness, there were increasing reports reaching the imperial government the Ukrainian leaders were plotting to separate from Russia and form their own separate national state. Because of the 1863 January uprising, tensions around Russia were incredibly high, and there was worry in the government that Poland was just the beginning and that other groups and other nations were going to rise up as well. In a way of preventing this, the third section of the Imperial Chancellery, that group that precedes the Okhrana if you remember, went on an arrest spree in Ukraine. About 500 Ukrainian nationalist activists were arrested in 1865. Sunday schools were deliberately closed and their publication activities were entirely suspended. And Ukrainian as a language was banned from being published full stop throughout the entirety of the Russian Empire. Again, very similar to his son in terms of the Russification policies there. So to conclude all this off, Alexander appears to have dealt with minority groups for the most part fairly well. Other than the Polish revolt, which almost got completely out of hand, he appears to have faced no major revolts during his reign. Even with the Polish revolt, he does appear to have benefited Russian interests. For example, Russian became the official language of government and administration, and the act of Polish conscription meant Russia had more troops in its army. Although there was nationalism from other regions, they were not strong enough to be a direct threat to Alexander II's rule. His son, Alexander III, was able to follow on from the work of his father and impose Russification on nearly all of the empire. The Tsar showed concern for most peoples of the empire. Other hints of separatism that appeared after 1864 were given much attention. For example, an official commission was set up in 1876 to investigate separatist activity in Ukraine. Alexander II also continued his father's liberal policy towards Baltic Germans. By Baltic Germans, by the way, I mean peoples of Latvia and Estonia. Apparently not Lithuania though. This was done in the face of rising nationalism in both states, mainly from the middle class intelligentsia, so the people who are doctors, lawyers, scholars, etc. The Tsar also took some practical measures to improve the outcomes for Jews. Some categories of Jews were allowed to live outside the Pale of Settlement, as previously discussed. During the rule of Alexander II, there was significant Russian expansion to Central Asia, and in general, they reacted in a responsible manner, making efforts to stop slavery in Central Asia and destroy banditry as well. It is important to bear the ethnic makeup of the empire in mind when you evaluate Alexander's achievements. And regardless of whether you think he was heavy-handed when it comes to Ukraine and Poland, or whether you think he showed his liberal side when it comes to Finland and the Jews, it is entirely up to you what you think. Remember, our purpose here is not necessarily to have our own opinion, it is to have the knowledge to judge other people's opinions and make assessments on the interpretations that we receive in our 30-mark questions. I hope this has been useful for you. I strongly recommend listening over this and making notes on it, as this is the best way to impart knowledge in the current climate. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me at mitchellc@aessessex.co.uk, and I will happily answer them for you. Have a lovely day.